In this interview, we talk about H. pylori, C. diff, antibiotics, what really makes up the microbiome. Are probiotics good for you? Should you be taking strains to support the microbiome? Should we be eating fermented foods? What really helps the microbiome thrive? And then what is impacting our microbiome that is impacting our overall health? Hey guys, my name is Judy Cho and I'm board certified in holistic nutrition. And I have a private practice where we have worked with over 2,000 carnivore clients and patients get closer to root cause healing. Today, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Neil Stollman. He is a GI doctor and he has done a lot of work in the C. diff and FMT world, or the fecal matter transplant world. We talk a lot about the microbiome, what makes a good microbiome, what allows for diversity. Is diversity important? What are things that will allow and support diversity? We talk about ferments, we talk about illnesses, antibiotics, and other gut illnesses, and if a colonoscopy is important. This conversation is really fun, and Dr. Stollman is very entertaining as an interview. This interview is very helpful if you have had any gut imbalances and shares a lot more nuance about the gut world, our understanding of the microbiome, what it does when we take antibiotics or antifungals or antimicrobials or antivirals. Some things we just don't know enough yet, but this conversation shares the latest about what we should think about, how to protect our bodies, and essentially how do you protect your biome that supports our overall immune health. Let's get right into the interview. Hi, Dr. Stollman. I am super excited to have you on my channel. We've talked a lot about gut stuff before this call, but I'm really excited to get into all the nuances. Even if we're not always on the same page, I think what matters the most is that people can learn, take the pieces that they want to try or levers that they can use so that they can have healing in the gut, because most people have some level of gut imbalances. And before we get started, if you could introduce yourself to the people that are listening and watching.
Absolutely. Howdy, I'm Neil, as I guess my name says, but I have a last name too. It's Stollman, Neil Stollman. I occasionally get an extra O because of what I do for a living. There's one O and two L's in my last name, but I helped sort of pioneer fecal transplants, so I occasionally buy an extra O, one O, two L's. Neil Stollman. I'm a GI doc. I'm a practicing semi-private practice, semi-academic GI doc. Currently, I've had a past that included the University of Miami and UCSF, but I am currently, and I'm still a voluntary faculty at UCSF, but my main gig is a private practice GI in beautiful downtown Oakland, which is what's in the window outside you behind me.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. You know, we people talk about the importance of the gut. I'm just curious from a GI doc himself, why is the gut so important and why are people having adverse symptoms occur to the gut, and what are some of the triggers that in our modern world is causing the gut to have dysbiosis, leaky gut, etc.?
Yeah, well, that's a simple question, isn't it? What's wrong with our guts? A lot, obviously, and that's why you and I both have a business in talking to people about their guts because they are. Well, now that's not new, right? I mean, there's old Hippocrates quotes about illness being in the guts and things like that. So the ancient Greeks and Romans understood at some level that the bowels are the seat of something in our body, and I guess we've sort of understood that at some level for a while, but it's really only recently, I think, that modern medicine has kind of acknowledged the biome, the microbiome. And to clarify, when I say biome, what I really mean is the gut biome. There are other biomes in and on us. We have a skin biome and a vaginal biome and underarm biomes and nasal biomes. We got lots of biomes. My world and expertise, of course, is the gut, particularly the colonic microbiome. And I think it's only recently that we knew there's bugs in us. That's not new news. We've known that. But I think we got really focused on other things like genetics, right? We've spent the last 50 years, sequencing the human genome and looking for gene therapy and sending people for genetic testing. Not to say that genetics don't underlie a lot of health and illness, of course they do, but we got sort of focused on that, and we sort of thought our poop was just poop. And I think we underestimated the importance of the ecosystem that lives in us. And it's, of course, a critically important ecosystem to our health. There are bugs. There is largely one bug that can live in our stomach. We can talk about that. Bugs shouldn't live too much in our small bowel, but do, and we can talk about that. But of course, bugs do live in our colon or large bowel. Those are synonyms, colon and large bowel, and they're supposed to. And in fact, we're not healthy if they don't. They are required for our health. And again, it's probably in the last 20, 30 years that we've really started to recognize that it's not just shit. It's not just crap. It's a milieu. And it's also not just kind of a list of bugs. It does things. Our biome is metabolically active. It is not just bugs that come in this way and go out the other way. It's not just a garden hose, a passageway, a passive tube. It's an active organism, our gut biome, that does sort of very important things that correlate very well with health and illness. And we know, at least in some very global way, that healthy people have a biome that looks sort of this way, and less healthy people have a biome that looks that way. Now, that sounds good, and that's important, of course, and we can talk more about what healthy kind of means in that context. But I'll also stress that for the next X minutes that we're talking, there's a lot of this we don't know. I mean, I wish I've been in this space for 20 years. We can talk about how I got into it. Dr. Hazen talked about learning about poop in part from our training together 25, 30 years ago. I got sort of focused on the biome 20 plus years ago when I got a phone call from a colleague and friend who's a sort of maven in C. diff, a world's expert in C. diff, and said, "Hey, Neil, there's a lady in Oakland and she's had this recurrent C. diff, and I want you to do a poop transplant on her." And I laughed, and I think I thought it was a prank. I think I thought she was kind of just prank calling me. She's a friend, and I said, "Yeah, right." And she said, "No, I'm being serious. I want you to do a poop transplant on her." And I said, "What's that?" That didn't. Again, I was sort of younger and more ignorant about this. And of course, we talked, and she's a really persistent and smart woman. And ultimately, she convinced me that this particular patient, had a problem that was very clearly caused by dysbiosis. That's a generic kind of word we use for messed up biome, right? An abnormal biome. So we'll call it a dysbiosis. And Neil, you need to fix her because people keep giving her antibiotics and that ain't fixing her biome. You need to fix her biome. And I think the way to do that is putting someone else's poop inside her. And I said to my friend, "Have you ever done that?" And she said, "No, are you crazy?" And I said, "Well, then how come you want me to do it?" And she said, "Because the lady's in Oakland and you're there and you're a good guy, so go do it." And we literally kind of talked out how to do it. There was absolutely no guidebook on how to do that 20 plus years ago. And, do we put it in saline or water or milk? And is there a milkshake? And how do you shake it? And how do you filter it? And how do you screen for the poop that you're going to put in to make sure it's healthy? And all of these things were unknowns. And we kind of started to figure them out. And over 20 years, I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of this and written some books and guidelines on this, and it's become a focus. But it's a long way of coming back to, and I'm rambling, I apologize, that I think I know less than I knew 20 years ago. I mean, I think we thought we understood this, and as we dive deeper and deeper into this, it gets more and more complicated. It's not nearly as simplistic as I think we wanted it to be. Anyway, so we have a biome. You asked a long question, of course. You asked a question of what happens, and I don't think there's any question that our modern biome is prone to disruption, our biome being a key part of maintaining our health, like a lot of other parts in us. So what disrupts our biome? We certainly know some of the obvious ones. Our diet, our Western diet is not a particularly good diet for health in general, right? I'll digress for 1 second to another anecdote. I was giving a talk this weekend somewhere else on diverticulitis, a different topic. We can come back to diverticulitis. It's an interesting topic to me. And we were talking about food as a risk. Diverticulosis are these pockets in our colon that can get inflamed or infected, and diverticulitis is the consequence of that in a small number of people who get it. And there's data looking at diet as a risk factor for diverticulitis. And one of the best studies that have looked at this, a giant study, 1 million patient years of people, it's distilled their diets into 2 categories. That's it. They're deciding A and B or 2 diets. And the first diet is the prudent diet. That's literally the name they chose for that. And not surprisingly, it's low in fats, it's high in fish and fiber and fruits and vegetables. Might not be your prudent diet necessarily because it was relatively low in red meat, more higher in white meats and fruits and vegetables, and certainly, a high fiber diet. So that was what they considered prudent. They gave it a favorable name. They called it a prudent diet. The opposite diet, so there's two arms only. The opposite diet of prudent is the Western diet. They literally, the two names for these are a good, healthy diet and our diet. They literally, I think they wanted to call it the imprudent diet, but they thought that wouldn't work well in a scientific paper. But you have a prudent diet and imprudent diet, except the imprudent diet is our diet. So our Western diet is in a lot of ways not healthy. And you've talked to people, I've perused your podcasts and listened to some, a lot about processed foods and the like, and how our diet is disrupting that. So that's certainly a part of it. Antibiotics are a giant part of it, right? It's impossible to get through life in this country without getting antibiotics, even our kids. And there's science looking at, we radically overuse antibiotics. And I'm certainly not suggesting that there aren't people who need antibiotics and who are going to die if they don't get antibiotics. Of course there are. And I'm not suggesting if someone says, yeah, you might die, take these antibiotics. Well, take these darn antibiotics. But we radically overprescribe antibiotics. There's ample science and data and confirmation to that. Probably half of the antibiotics we give people in this country, we didn't need to give people. We do it for various reasons, risk aversion and this culture of treatment that we have. But antibiotics are a dominant reason. And the average, I think, American kid has had like 3 or 4 courses of antibiotics by the time they get to high school or something. I mean, and again, some of them are reasonable. If you get strep throat, you need antibiotics. If you get bacterial ear infection, you need antibiotics. But if you walk in the door with, a sore throat or this or that, mom wants antibiotics. The pediatrician wants to get rid of mom. Mom gets antibiotics. Everybody wins, except the gut biome of that kid that has now been altered by this. Obviously, we live in a stressful world, and we don't really understand much about the role of stress in the biome, but I can assure you it ain't good, certainly. So we have created a world around us, this environment around us, that is unfortunately not biome health oriented. And so I think a lot of us have altered biomes, and I think that's a big part of that. We are what we eat, and that can be a wonderful positive. It can also be a really problematic negative.
And so in terms of the biome, when it's imbalanced, obviously we see that maybe you said that there's sort of a perfect looking or like a better looking biome that's healthier. And then I see research where it'll say this strain. So the one that I always pick on is Akkermansia. So they'll say Akkermansia mucinophila. If it's too low, that's the reason you're overweight. But we don't actually see that in our practice, so I don't know how true that is. But then if it's in excess, it actually has correlations with MS. I think when we get to that granular of it is this one strain that does everything, I am so suspect. And then if it's a probiotic company that's released that study too, then I'm extra. But I'm curious your thoughts when you say that you now know less, even being in the field. Is that an example of that?
Yeah, it's a beautiful example. Thank
Okay.
you. So Akkermansia is a weird one. There's a lot of bugs, of course. Akkermansia is clearly the it girl, the sexy bug du jour, for whatever reason. I mean, there's some reason, there's some science showing that levels correlate with something. So right now, yes, Akkermansia is the hot button. You spoke to Dr. Hazen last week. She's all about bifido, and she's not making that up. There's ample reasons in biology to why bifido bacteria are important to our health. But both of those things, I'm thinking it's Akkermansia or bifido, I think is a really flawed way to look at it, because as you clearly understand and hinted at, it's not one bug, one effect, not even close to that. You have thousands and thousands of different species of bugs in you, and they're not lone rangers, right? They don't work in isolation at all. They are absolutely in community. We make up language for this, but communities or consortia, they are bundled. They live in villages. What's that? It takes a village, right? Your bugs are not lone rangers. They're simply not. And the intellectual premise that I have a problem because I don't have enough of bug X, all that I have to do is take a pill of bug X and I will be better and healthier is so clearly not true. Yet it fits a narrative and it drives purchases of things, certainly. So, and people want an answer. Of course, we all want an answer. So if the answer is, hey, you got low Akkermansia, go get some more Akkermansia, that seems logical. It seems wonderful. I'd buy a jar of that if I thought it was going to fix me. But I think it's just flawed because I think it fails to recognize The interplay of bugs. Again, no one bug is in any way really going to make anybody healthier. I really don't believe that. Bugs are absolutely communities, so that's part of it. The other part is that they're clearly doing things, as I suggested earlier. It's not just a list of bugs and they each sit down in rows like in an auditorium. Your gut biome is not an auditorium, and there's 1,000 seats, and seat A is Akkermansia, and seat B is Bifido, and seat C is Firmicutes. Of course it's not. They're going out, they're having lunch and dinner and meeting in breakout rooms and writing white papers. These bugs are doing things with each other in subsets. So it's a really flawed, I think, narrative to list bugs. We can do that, right? We can take human stool from thousands and thousands of people and PCR it and scan it and figure out what's in there and list the bugs. We can give you a list and people will send their stool off and spend a couple $100 and get a list of bugs. But I would suggest that list of bugs in isolation is almost useless. Just the list, of bugs, and some are green and some are yellow and some are red, but it's just a list of bugs. And sometimes I use a metaphor. Sabine talked about a garden. I sort of talk about a forest sometimes. We all have our plant metaphors for our biome. But if you and I walked to the middle of the forest and sat down, and then I had a magical computer and I scanned around and I printed out a piece of paper that listed the 10,000 organisms that lived in this forest, and there's 1,000, there's 500 trees and 600 birds and 1,000 insects and lizards and all that, and I gave you a list of these things. You took it home to your kids and said, "Here's the forest I was at." That list of organisms has nothing to do with that forest we were in. Really nothing. It's just a list. It's an Excel spreadsheet of the names of the things that are there. I think, not to be too cynical, but I think that's in part true of our current understanding of the biome. A list of the names of the bugs is not yet actionable. It will be, and of course it will be, and we want it to be, and it's going to take a lot of computers and analytics, and there's this whole new field of biome statisticians. There's such a numbers game here that you need specialists to understand the numbers and a really strong computer to try to look at those things in that spreadsheet and now tease out what's really good, bad, helpful, not helpful, things like that. Okay. I guess I could say I've just spent 10 minutes. What a horrible guest. I've just spent 10 minutes telling you that we don't know anything. You brought me on because you thought I knew something, and now I've told you we don't know anything. One of the things I think is true, and patients all day ask about how we'll talk about how to get a better biome, but do I have a good biome, or is my biome healthy? Can we check for that? And my answer generally is it's not sort of easy to check for that. But one of the things that I'm optimistic is going to hold true is that a more diverse ecosystem is healthier than a less diverse ecosystem. And we can measure that. There are ways to measure diversity of your ecosystem. And it's in a simple way, it's sort of the number of bugs you have, the number of different bugs you have, the number of different species over the total number, right? So if you had, 100 different, you had a billion bugs and of 1,000 different species, you'd have a diversity of X. But if you had a billion bugs and 2,000 different species, you'd have a diversity score that was 2X. That was higher than that. So if you simply look at healthy people and unhealthy people tend to have a high diversity score. Unhealthy people tend to have a lower diversity score. When people get sick, certainly with C. diff, which is sort of we can and should talk about C. diff. C. diff is not all that important as a disease. It doesn't kill millions of people, but it's kind of the proof of concept of bacteriotherapy, right? C. diff is this first disease where I think we very clearly identified a disease caused by a biome disruption that we can fix by biome augmentation, right? It is caused by a problem in a biome, and we can fix it with a fecal transplant and putting in a new biome. So that's kind of the one area where I think we know that's true. But those patients start with a horribly diverse biome, a very non-diverse biome, and they end with a more diverse biome. And that's been shown in a bunch of things. So I do think that's true. I do think the simplest kind of thing to target for people is their diversity, not bug X, not bug Y, but think of it as a field rather than a one thing. And I do talk to patients about trying to expand that diversity. And I think that is almost certainly true.
Hey guys, just a really quick interruption. If you notice, we don't really run ads on this YouTube channel. And just being fully candid, instead of making money on external sponsors, we really wanted to share more about our functional medicine practice so that if you ever need it, you know that what we offer and what we can provide in terms of service and products. If you didn't know, our private practice has one-on-one sessions. We have packages. We do group calls with SIRS and with mind body or nervous system regulation. And we also do a lot of functional tests. Some people do a complete wellness panel with us. So once a year, they get a detailed, comprehensive blood work to see how their health is doing. We also do functional tests such as stool tests to see if you have parasites or candida or H. pylori. We also do a lot of the Dutch urine as well as saliva tests to make sure that your hormones and thyroid is functioning well. Our flagship is our symptom burden, where we really trust the innate wisdom in our bodies. And so we are trying to see what symptoms do you have, because oftentimes a combination of symptoms is related to a specific system. We focus on gut health, where we try to get people's gut healing, because most of our immune system is in our gut. If you make your own body stronger, you will be a lot more resilient to everything that is in our toxic world. We believe in wellness for all, and not everyone can afford to work with us. So we provide a lot of free guides, free ebooks, free downloads, free tactical things to get you healing in your wellness journey. We also write comprehensive, detailed articles. For example, why a carnivore diet may have lower T3 markers, but may be in fact okay. I hope that the content I share is enough for you to get healing. But if the needle is not moving enough with a carnivore diet, with lifestyle changes, with mind body work, if it's not moving enough when you are working alone, just know that we have the services to support you when and if that day comes. Because we are holistic health, we also have a prescriber. So if you are on thyroid medications or hormone medications, or you need medications for SIRS, we are able to walk you through the process. Our goal is to get you off most of your medications. All right, guys, thank you for being part of this community. Let's get back into the video. So a couple things from what you shared. So we talked about probiotics offline and how you're not the biggest fan, and I support your thoughts on that. So my thought is, so based on everything you said, I don't believe, and I'm on the same page with you, that, I don't think by just taking Akkermansia, you're going to fix, and then now you're going to magically be thin. That logic never made sense to me. But from talking to other GI doctors, not saying that they're right, but just the logic of, if I were to take keystone strains, whether it's bifido or lacto or some spore-based, and you're sort of just putting a diverse amount in your system, that in a sense, maybe in some studies that the broader diversity of those strains or getting those keystones to then support your system. And then in our practice, if we just see that the outcome is, oh yes, this person is reducing their skin imbalances or showing that they are improving in some adverse symptoms. So then to me, that's where we would try the probiotic, not necessarily saying that probiotic is fully working, but maybe they are giving some magical strain in there or a blend of it that's allowing something to work differently in the body, and it's now healing. And I would think that in the FMTs, if we don't know exactly what the strains look like, just like if we went into the forest, we pulled out all the things, get it all in a spreadsheet, essentially, I would think that's how you're also deciding if a certain person's their stool is safe enough, is because you see that list, but there's no guarantee that those specific markers are the ones of health. Now, I know Dr. Sabine says that there are, like fingerprints, but wouldn't doing the FMT be almost similar to, here's some of the keystone strains in probiotics, and maybe they can help you, maybe they won't. But because I know that if we were to try like fermented veggies and then we try to get the short chain fatty acids, the problem with a lot of the vegetables that we use now are sprayed with glyphosate and other antimicrobial foods too. So it's just, how do we know that it's not killing off stuff in the system too?
Yeah, you're spot on, of course, and I'll take the end and I'll work back hopefully.
Okay.
But the solution to badly treated vegetables is not to not eat vegetables. It's find better treated vegetables that are not sprayed or grown organically, right? So I wouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, yes, I don't dispute it. You're right, for sure that's true. But I would counter, I guess, with my patient and say, don't not eat vegetables because vegetables have toxins sprayed on them for various reasons, for preservation and or bugs or whatever.
Yes.
I would say find better vegetables, get to a
Okay.
farmer's market and whatever, and find better treated vegetables. I'd also say that I'm not anti-probiotic, although
Okay.
that's like a double negative. I'm anti-pill-based probiotics, to be
Okay.
very precise. So again, my career is predicated on the importance of the biome. I helped invent and pioneer fecal transplants. I write the guidelines on this. I'm very embedded in this world, so I don't at all downplay the medical importance of our biome or augmenting our biome with bugs. I absolutely do. I just don't think that for the most part, the model of one bug in a pill is going to do that. Now, so that's what I'm arguing against. Not the probiotics per se, but this concept that by this bug in this pill that you're going to somehow fix this thing. So I tend to drive, and by the way, a poop transplant, in a sense, you're using that as an example of, yes, we can fix a problem. And I agree fully, but I guess I counter and say it sort of not proves, but suggests also that we can't tease a poop transplant, a whole stool poop transplant is basically acknowledging that I don't know which bugs to give my patient. So I'm just going to give them whole stool, which includes the bugs and the bile salts and the metabolome, right? I'm sort of in a sense acknowledging that I've not been able to do what I want to do. Of course, I want to do that. I want to peel out for this patient, these bugs are the right ones. But the fact that we've not been able to do that, and that's still our most effective thing, at least in C. diff certainly, is whole human stool, which again sort of recognizes that I can't find you the right thing to give you. So I'm just going to press the easy button and give it all to you. That may not be the right answer eventually, right? Eventually, the right answer is to hone in on exactly those species like you want. I just don't think we know that yet well enough to do that. So we do the poop transplant. That's not the long-term answer. The long-term answer is exactly as you suggest. We kind of got, I think, a little spoiled in C. diff because it turns out that C. diff is C. diff or C. difficile, this infection that happens after antibiotics, where we treat it with more antibiotics that don't work. So then we do a poop transplant, which does work. And it works because we're essentially putting everything in. But I think it spoiled us because it works almost all the time. I mean, outcomes data on poop transplants for C. diff are very high, 80, 90%. It's really incredibly effective. And it doesn't really matter how much poop you put in, where you put it, who donated it. Poop transplants are stupid effective in C. diff. And I think that made us think it's going to be simple. And it ain't going to be simple, assuredly. And when you start looking at any other biome therapy for any other illness not named C. diff, it gets much more complicated. The next one we do a lot of looking at in GI. We're looking at of course, biome restoration in autism and Parkinson's and weight loss and metabolic syndrome and graft versus host disease and chemotherapy. I mean, there's a million things we're looking at. IBS certainly. We're looking at biome interventions for. I suspect the next one we're going to see truly demonstrated evidence-based will be ulcerative colitis, which is another thing in my world where you have a sort of autoimmune disease attacking your colon. Your body's kind of attacking your colon because it thinks there's some bad guy there. There may or may not be a bad guy. If there is, we don't know what it is or we can't see it, but your body thinks there's something there, so it's kind of attacking it. And we use immune suppression for that illness, which is horrible. It has a lot of side effects, but because that's what we do, that's the best way to kind of do that, is to kind of try to dial back the body's attack. People have looked at FMTs and fecal transplants in this population a lot, and I suspect it's likely working. It seems to be working, but there's two caveats that weren't true in C. diff. One, it's going to take multiple treatments, and I wish that weren't true. It'd be nice, which means you probably need pills because for these bugs. So here I just told you bugs don't come in a pill, and now I've come full circle and said, yeah, bugs have to come in pills, just because you can't do enemas every day for 3 months, right? No one's practically speaking going to do daily enemas. And, one enema is a challenge. No one's really going to do that. But the data on treatment for ulcerative colitis is repetitive treatment. So it's not, C. diff is one and done. You throw it in there, however you do, an enema, a colonoscopy, whatever, and people get better. For ulcerative colitis, it's going to be multiple treatments. It ain't going to be one and done. The other thing we're finding in ulcerative colitis patients is what we label a donor effect, meaning in C. diff, I said, doesn't matter. There was a stool bank. They've just shut down, actually, but there's another one in Minnesota. They have dozens and dozens of donors. And we look at the data for C. diff. What does donor A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, or K have any difference? They're all 90%. It just doesn't matter. Every donor is essentially 90%, not in ulcerative colitis. In ulcerative colitis, there's a radical difference among donors. So there's one sort of famous study that had 5 donors, A, B, C, D, and E, and B was magical. We call it the donor B effect now because B, I'm making up a number, but it was 80% effective. I'm not sure if that's the right number, but it was really effective. And donors A, C, D, and E were barely effective. So to your point of these, what's the right bugs, in ulcerative colitis in this study, we clearly see a signal that these bugs matter and these bugs maybe don't matter as much. So now, of course, the next step is to hone in on donor B. Who are you, super donor? Why are you, what is it about you, but what is it about your ecosystem that works in ulcerative colitis specifically? And donor A's ecosystem does work in C. diff, but doesn't work in ulcerative colitis. Back to my statisticians who have to do all the math to kind of figure out why that is. So I do believe we're in probiotics in a sense, right? I do believe putting bugs in is going to make sense. If I gave an impression that I'm anti-probiotic, I don't mean that. I guess I'm anti this sort of simplistic model of one bug in a pill taken is going to somehow fix my skin or my brain fog or my IBS or whatever. It's probably not.
Right. No, I agree. If chronic illness was that simple, we would all not have a job, right? If it was that simple, I would love it to be just do this and therefore you will have your full health. I'm curious with one thing you said. So you're saying that in FMTs, it doesn't really matter the person that you get it from. For the most part, C. diff will eradicate is what I'm hearing. So then when there's like a stool bank, if we don't fully know how the map of the microbiome should look for somebody to be healthy or to get the health, what are factors that we're looking at to say this person qualifies or is a good candidate to give the FMT to?
We're not there yet. We want to be there and we will be there. Right now, it's really, again, very sort of brute force. We make sure you haven't had antibiotics in some window of time. I'm actually on a panel right now, a European panel, trying to decide for stool banks in Europe, what are the criteria for that? And it's 10 people in a room and we're talking it out. There's not a fact-based answer to that question. It's sort of best guess. But so first of all, you certainly want someone who hasn't had antibiotics or chemotherapy or biome disruptive agents in some period of time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. You can draw a line wherever you want. You would like someone, and again, we can measure diversity, the Shannon Diversity Index. There's a measure for that. You'd like someone who has a higher diverse score than a lower diverse score. We exclude anyone who has had a family history of A, B, C, D, and E, young cancers or heart disease or something. But this is guessing, right? So we're basically trying to find the perfect 18-year-old who's never, we don't use infants, we use young adults largely for various reasons, but who's like never been in a hospital, never had surgery, barely ever had antibiotics or not in X years, eats a good healthy diet, doesn't take any medicine, doesn't have a family history, isn't obese, doesn't have a family history of obesity or cancer or heart disease. And that's a unicorn. That's a hard thing to find. There's kind of a joke in our world. The stool bank I mentioned was called Open Biome. The FDA, they've sort of shuttered for public use right now. They're at MIT. And the joke at MIT was that it was easier to get admitted to MIT, which, by the way, has a 6% admission rate, than to be a poop donor at MIT, which has a 5% acceptance rate. Because who doesn't want to get paid $50 for doing what you're going to do every morning anyway if you're a poor student at MIT? So the stool bank puts up a sign, says, come be a stool donor. And for 20 kids that come in, because who doesn't want to pay for their college that way? For 20 kids who walk in the door and get tested, we kick out 19 of them. And we only keep one of them. So we do our best, but to your real question, we don't have a hard and fast sort of biology to that. We want to get there. Of course, we want to get there. And people are actively looking at this. It takes a lot of computing and a lot of stats to kind of weed out what is it about donor B for ulcerative colitis. And by the way, it might be donor G for Parkinson's, and it might be donor F for drug-resistant, E. coli, whatever, for different things. So it may not be that a super donor is a super donor for more than one thing. Maybe they're a super donor And then the final step of that is if we're really, really smart in 1 year, it's going to take forever to do this, forget stool, can we then sort of create synthetic stool? Can we say, okay, here's the parameters? Because stool's messy and it might have bugs in it we don't understand. I mean, there's an inherent risk in using stool that we try to mitigate really, really, really well, but imperfectly so. There's been at least one fatality from a stool transplant in this country. That's over 20 years and 100,000 stool transplants, so it's a very small number. But there is a potential risk there. The ultimate holy grail, right, is to get to the pill that contains the right 27, or whatever it is, right, and give people this targeted thing. We are so far from that. And I want to be there. My life would be very easy if I could do that. But we're still so, so far from that.
In a podcast, you mentioned that C. diff. So one, I know that C. diff, all of us can carry a lot, but it's only certain people that actually might get sick. Why is that? And then you mentioned this fascinating thing about the spore form. Can you share a little bit about, why do some people get sick? And I actually saw a study, and I don't know how valid the study is, but that if you are in a hospital and to prevent yourself from getting C. diff, you should take probiotics. I don't know how valid that study was, but curious, why do some people get sick from C. diff and others don't?
Yeah, right. So two things have to happen to get sick from C. diff. You have to be exposed to C. diff, and that harkens to the spore part of the question. I'll circle back to that. And you have to have a vulnerable biome or ecosystem, right? You have to be vulnerable. And I use that word as if I know what that means, but you have to have less diversity or have some of your good guys gone. And that not always, but almost always is a consequence of antibiotics, which is why hospital people do that. And by the way, it's reasonable to give people yogurt with antibiotics. It's probably not going to prevent C. diff, but it might cause less diarrhea. People may feel better. There's some data for that. It probably doesn't actually prevent C. diff, but it's reasonable to try. So you have to be exposed and you have to have a vulnerable biome. We talked about how you get a vulnerable biome, largely antibiotics or chemotherapy or some other, or living in a nursing home. So my grandma Minnie, she's a metaphor. She's actually not a metaphor. She's a real person, but she's dead. Grandma Minnie, so I'm going to use Grandma Minnie. Grandma Minnie gets UTI, so she gets antibiotics and that messes up her biome. And then she gets older and she has to go into the skilled nursing facility. Something like 50%, spend a week living in a skilled nurse, not visiting, living in a skilled nursing facility, and you will become colonized, not necessarily ill, but colonized with C. diff. And then, of course, if we give you antibiotics, we will mess you up further. So you have to be vulnerable and you have to get exposed to the bug. And you're correct that you can get exposed to the living bug, but most people don't get exposed to the living bug. They get exposed to these spores. And that's the core problem. It's why we have a C. diff epidemic. Well, two reasons. We have overuse of antibiotics, but this bug lives in two forms. There is a bacteria. It's got little flagella. It's hairy. We call it a hairy hot dog. It swims around and it runs around, and that's the living bug. And it's actually pretty easy to kill that bug. That bug is not hard to kill. So the problem with this bug, the C. diff, is not so much the bacteria. It's the bacteria we can beat up. It's these little spores that come out of us and live outside of us in this environment for weeks and months, literally, and they're hard to kill. Alcohol doesn't kill them. We all love our hand sanitizers. I'm a little bit Lady Macbethish in the hospital. I go, in the hospital, they're hanging outside every room, those little hand sanitizers. So I grab some and I do it and I feel good. And I grab the next one and I feel good. That's alcohol. That's what hand sanitizers largely are. Alcohol is great for a bunch of bugs, does nothing, for example, for C. diff spores. Nothing. So you're not preventing C. diff. You need to use actually soap and warm water. Yay. That still is a thing. Soap and warm water. Don't throw out soap and warm water. Or bleach, which is actually very effective so my C. diff patients bleach their homes, basically. They have to go and bleach everything at home. But the spores are insensitive to most of the things we do. So that's what happens is people get exposed to you asked how this happens. You have to have a biome that's vulnerable. Again, that's a soft term, but it's a real one. And then you have to get exposed to these spores. The spores come in orally. I mentioned they come out the bottom. They go in the top. They go through you. And then in your small intestine and colon, they germinate. They're smart. They're little smart bombs that outside in the world are shielded. But once they go into the warm, beautiful small intestine at a temperature of 98, whatever, and all the other good humors that are there, they wake up and they germinate, and then they go to the colon and they make us sick again. So that's sort of what happens with that.
It sounds like it's hard to really then eradicate C. diff because even if I bleach my whole house, the minute I go to the grocery store or any public place, if it lasts for a month, there's a high chance it's still there. So then my only defense is really to strengthen, make myself less vulnerable, correct? And
Correct.
and then the thought is, well, actually, so maybe then what can I do then to strengthen myself so that I won't get as exposed or not exposed, but not as vulnerable to C. diff?
Right. So of course, I'm going to, if you need me because you have active C. diff, I'll do a stool transplant, which is the ultimate way to do that. But that's not, unless you have C. diff, that's not sort of available to you. But yeah, you got to augment your biome the best you can. So that's the core question is, how can I make my biome as healthy as I possibly can? And there are some things that we know. We talked a little about some of the dietary things. First of all, avoiding processed foods, avoiding emulsifiers, avoiding artificial sweeteners. All of those are really biome toxic in a lot of different ways. So you should try to eat a good, healthy, again, we can talk about the meat amount. You and I might have different views on how much meat should be in our diet, but we both agree, I'm sure, that we don't want a whole lot of ultra processed foods, a whole lot of preservatives and emulsifiers and those things. So we want to, and high fructose corn syrup and a lot of other those things that we know are bad for a biome. Obviously, you want to avoid things that mess up your biome, like antibiotics or such, or steroids. Most people don't choose to take antibiotics, but if given an opportunity, you want to avoid it. And then and feel free to spar with me on this because you may have a different point on this, but I do believe that bug-laden foods, living foods, fermented foods, probiotic foods, we have a lot of different names for them, are beneficial. And the key to that is, again, this word I keep coming back to, a diversity of them, right? So it's a diet, and you're obviously into nutrition and diet, of course, by training and expertise. And I suspect you talk to people about diversity of their inputs. In my old days, I would tell people, so go get some yogurt, and they'd go home, they'd eat 3 things of yogurt every day, and they'd come back a month later and they're no better because probably on day 2 they've gotten all the good yogurt bugs. But there's other things, of course, they should do. And by the way, speaking of yogurt's not great generically. Kefir, or I think it's probably kefir. You live in Austin, you hang out with hipsters. Is it kefir?
I've heard it both, and since I
All
don't
right.
really eat it, I don't even know which one's the right way.
My kids say kefir, I think, but
I've heard both. I've heard
they're
both.
young and hip too. I'm an old man. Kefir or kefir is a drinkable yogurt, but the way it's made happens to be very bug promoting, and it has. If you just look at it, if you buy 10 different yogurts in the supermarket and then say what bugs are in what yogurt, most yogurt doesn't have a ton, or they might have one. Dannon adds it, adds lactobacillus to things. But kefir has great bugs. Among the yogurts, if you're drinking yogurt because you want to augment your ecosystem, if that's the endpoint, not taste is your endpoint, eat what you want. But if your endpoint is adding good bugs to the mix, kefir is a good one. Everybody kind of knows about kombucha, right, which is a fermented tea-based drink. So it's not dairy, there's no vegetables or anything, and it's literally fermented tea, which has a really good biome load in it. Kimchi, which of course is fermented cabbage. It's Korean cabbage, of course. Sauerkraut, German fermented cabbage, basically. And when I say sauerkraut, or by the way, both of those, I'm being very clear, I mean raw, unpasteurized, right? Found in the fridge section of your supermarket, not in a glass jar on the shelf, because sauerkraut in a glass jar on the shelf and pickles in a glass jar on the shelf are pasteurized, which is really good for their longevity on the shelf. And if you're an end of lifer and you have a bomb shelter and you want sauerkraut in your bomb shelter, you should buy glass jarred pasteurized sauerkraut because it'll last a lot longer than the fridge plastic laden sauerkraut. But the glass jar has nothing in it. We've killed the bugs. There's a little bit of microbiologic irony, a phrase I probably never uttered before, but microbiologic irony in that the word we use to kill bugs in a food is pasteurization. The guy who sort of discovered bugs, like literally the guy who turned us on to bugs and said, look, these are bugs. We're using his name to kill bugs. I think that's rude. I think pasteurization should be used for something bug positive, not something bug negative. But pasteurization is very much bug negative. So you need a food that is not pasteurized, certainly. And a lot of, frankly, good, healthy fruits and vegetables have bugs in and on them. Apple cores. I just read a thing recently about the core of an apple is bug laden for whatever. I don't know how it got there, but it did. And the admonition, if it was accurate, was eat really close. Don't eat apple seeds. They have like traces of arsenic in them, but eat really close to the core of the apple. And eat the skin, which probably carries bugs in it too. So those are the things that I think you can do. I predicate that belief on some science. I'm not just making that up. One of my favorite studies in this space comes out of Stanford, just down the road from where I am, where there's a husband and wife team called the Sonnenbergs, and they're married and they do biome research, and they do really good biome research. And one of the studies they did was in healthy people. So these were not C. diff people or sick people, but healthy people. I think it was 20 and 20, some small-ish number, who were put on a controlled diet for 21 days, I believe. If I get the specifics wrong, it doesn't matter. The logic is the logic. And they were forced into a very proscribed diet. They were forbidden from eating anything that wasn't in this box that they got for every day. Here's your food. You can only eat what we give you. And they measured a lot of poop parameters before and a lot of poop parameters after. And the two arms of the trial, one was a high fiber diet, kind of the traditional prudent diet, actually, because we've so bought into fiber, and fiber is important, but we probably overemphasized fiber for people. But it was a super high fiber diet, lots and lots of 35 grams, 40 grams, some high load of fiber per day. The other arm was amplified with living foods or fermented foods or probiotic foods. Now, to be fair, they were giving 6 servings a day of a living food. That's impossible. No one on the planet is eating 6 servings a day of a living food. So they bombed them with kombucha and kefir and sauerkraut and miso and kimchi and all of these things, and then followed them for 3 weeks, I think. And the fermented food group, their poop was way better in terms of diversity and inflammatory index and the things we looked at. I won't get into the little microbiology, mostly because I don't understand most of it, but suffice it to say, more of the good things happened in the fermented food arm. And basically they showed that, yes, if your patients eat a lot, to be fair, a lot more than probably your patients are probably going to eat, they can alter their biome from here to here in what we think is a more favorable way. So that's important. I think it sort of establishes that not only does it feel good to eat those foods, but that they actually change your ecosystem in I think a favorable way.
So a couple things. And obviously I've heard those thoughts a lot. And I think it makes logical sense that you should get whatever will feed your microbiome and the good gut bugs from food. And so there has been a subset in our community that maybe they are very mast cell or histaminic sensitive. And so the ferments in that way will irritate them and then they won't feel well. There's another population that suffers from candida. And I believe it's also because they're really maybe mold colonized or they live in a water damaged building. So there's a lot of fungus. So then whenever they eat ferments, that also feeds the candida and those other bugs in the system. But aside from all of those people, just assuming like, hey, I just want wellness. And then I think about, so I'm actually Korean American. And so I had kimchi at our house all day long. And my parents probably had it 5 to 6 times. And what I'll tell you is, and I've been to Korea a few times, you would assume that based on, and I guess it's because maybe we are not controlling for their level of processed foods or their exposure to C. diff or whatever other illness there is. But these people are eating kimchi all the time and most likely not pasteurized. They're eating the ones that mom makes at home. And I don't see our population of people being extra robust or extra microbiome protected than maybe say the other population. So that's where my logic of, I've been eating mostly meat-based for the last 7 years. I almost never eat kimchi, even though my mom makes it for me. And so I'll do, out of respect, I'll eat some.
You're disappointing your mother, I'm
I
certain.
know, don't tell her.
You. Right.
No. But we literally have some in the fridge because my husband's also Korean American. But so I'll have it once in a blue moon. It's just not my favorite thing. But I don't fear that I'm not well. And I'm in my early 40s and everything hormonal, everything is pretty clean. So am I just a unicorn? Or, I mean, because if it's a fiber, a ferment, I really don't eat those things.
Well, I think you're eating you're probably, Judy, eating a great diet, right? I mean, forget the meat plus or minus component of it. You're a nutritionist. You are
Okay.
on this planet, you're probably the most aware of what you're putting into you and your family's stomach. So you're eating I'm sure, broad-based, healthy diet. So, and there's bugs in lots, it doesn't have to be kombucha and kefir, right? I mean, or other fermented foods. And I totally buy, I'm not expert in mast cell disease, and I don't want to go there because it's not my deep
Okay.
expertise, but it's a real issue. And histamine foods, I mean, again, I'm a gastroenterologist in Berkeley. You believe me, my patients are aware of mast cell illness and histamine stimulating food. So yes, we have to finesse those. And I go through with patients and kick out the ones they can't do, right? If you are made worse by kombucha, then obviously, you're not going to have kombucha. If dairy is a problem for you need to find a water kefir or a non-dairy kefir, which exists. You
Right.
can find others. So I think there are some workarounds. I bet there's one in Austin, but in Berkeley, there's literally a store called the Cultured Pickle Shop, which is, I don't have anything to do with them. I don't mean to promote any take. There is a store named whatever but is 50 different living. It's an entire store dedicated to what we're talking about. So I'm pretty sure, and it's expensive, and it's a privilege to be able to eat that well. It's true of
Right.
all of the things. I'm acknowledging that. I take care of a very diverse population here in Oakland, from rich to poor, and it's quite the privilege to be able to walk into a very bougie store in Berkeley and find all these bone broths and these great things that cost a lot more than what's available at the Safeway down the street, full of processed foods and sugars and corn syrup and all the above. So it is challenging. It's not so simple to just do it, but I think you still have to try. I still think that's the best I got.
Okay.
So
And I think that's fair. We have clients that will try the water kefir because that's the way they're trying to support their gut. And if anything moves the needle in a positive way, I don't think we should ever be dogmatic and say, no, everybody that's eating this is wrong. And so I think with even kefir or kombucha, if you're adding a ton of sugar, which we know impacts the microbiome, that's also probably not ideal. So in a perfect world, you grow your own stuff and then I'm right there with you. I think that makes
right, a
full sense.
backyard garden, and right, we had good biomes probably 100
Right.
years ago or even less before we started milling our grains. All this we do is modern, right? We didn't do any of this 100 years ago. You ate food, you ate whole food.
So I have a question for you. If antibiotics are so bad and we know it's a culprit of C. diff, and then yet we give people that have C. diff antibiotics, but then we know that it's going to cause, so it's why are we
It's horrible. It's the
okay?
it's the worst thing in the world. We should be fixing their biome from the get go. In fact, I'm right now taking care of a patient who I will not name, of course. And we have a group of C. diff experts who have an email group.
Oh,
We
okay.
talk about tough cases, and we've brought him into our circle because of that. And that's exactly the whole thrust. This poor guy, we ruined him, and he's going to need a transplant. Ultimately, that's where this is driving. But he's had C. diff multiple times, and they just keep bombing him with antibiotics, and they're making it worse. They're not making him better. They make him better for a week because for a week they kill the active C. diff that grew
Okay.
up, but they f up his biome worse. So now he's more vulnerable than he started. So his C. diff wakes up or the spores come back, right? And then we give him more antibiotics. So I agree with you fully. In C. diff, certainly, it's the wrong approach by far. And we should be doing biome interventions. I would suggest immediately is the right. This is a disease caused by, now these people are sick, so you probably have to give them some antibiotic acutely if they're symptomatic and sick, because biome fixing is not happening in 24 hours. So we're going to use that antibiotics. But I do think it's a dual approach. And there are now two products on the market that I'm not going to get into specifically, nor do I want to, but they are both called LBPs, which is now the government term for an FDA approved superbug potion. They're called live biotherapeutic products, LBPs. The FDA didn't even know what to call them. So we have a new word, LBP, live biotherapeutic product. There are two of them. One is a pill of some spores of some things. The other is actually human stool.
Okay.
Both donor derived. They're not synthetic. They're both donor derived. But they're both sold, the point I was coming back to, by the FDA very, very clearly as combined with antibiotics. They are not their own therapy. The antibiotics are not the own therapy. It's kind of a chaser. It's a coupled therapy. Okay, give your patient the antibiotics for a short period of time to kill these living bugs that are running around. But now you have to chase that down with a biome remediation of some sort, because if you don't, we know what's going to happen, right? So I think they're both. I think you need both.
So a couple things. If I'm not struggling with C. diff, but I have to take antibiotics for some other thing, whether it's chronic Lyme, ear infection, whatever things that people deem necessary for antibiotics. Eventually, if I get on, so the child that you said at 18 has already taken 4 rounds of antibiotics, now I am more susceptible to C. diff. So could we lessen the load of antibiotics? And then additionally, as you know, since you're the expert of this biome that we don't fully understand, the biome is not just bacteria, it's also viruses and
Mhm.
other things and fungus. And are we allowing the imbalance to become greater in some other monstrous way because we're just killing off the bacteria that we only know of, but we don't know what other monster we're creating in the interim?
There's so much true in that I don't even know where to start. But yes, for sure. So we've been talking about bacteria, and that's on me because that's wrong, right? I mean, so we understand bacteria. We can see them. We can name them. I can give you a spreadsheet. But you've highlighted, and that kind of hinted early, well, it's not just that they're there, but they're doing things. But I left off an entire important thing that thank you for bringing up, which is it ain't just bacteria,
Right.
right? That's completely fallacious to think your stool is just back. We say bugs sort of generically, but as you know, fungi are a big problem. I'm not expert in fungal overgrowth and SIFO, but I'll tell you one tiny little anecdote is as I get older, I'm believing it more and more. So I will tell you 5 years ago, I was probably a SIFO skeptic. And if I'd seen
Okay.
your post on that 5 years ago, I might have rolled my eyes. I'm mea culpa. 5 years later, I'm believing more and more that that's a legitimate thing. So
Okay.
this old man can learn a little bit as he goes. But there's fungi, of course. There's viruses, right? There's archaea. There are phages. There are all these other things that we're invisible to. We culture the bugs, but we're totally deluding ourselves if we that's the other reason, by the way, why the bug in a pill ain't going to be the answer, probably because there's so much other stuff in that, which is why whole human stool at the moment is still our best treatment, because it's a soup of all of the things that you mentioned, right? So if I could easily, safely, inexpensively just put poop back in people, that's what I would do. By the way, people have suggested, it doesn't exist yet that I'm aware of, maybe we should go into business on this. How about a stool bank to bank your own stool? Autologous stool banking has been discussed. I didn't make up that concept, but to the point, your kid's going to grow up and get antibiotics and their biome's going to get denuded over time, right? How about you take your 5-year-old or your 10-year-old, or you figure out where the right number is and collect their healthy stool, and freeze it. And we know you can freeze and thaw stool and it works. We've proven that a million times. So how about we take your kid's stool before he goes to college and gets chlamydia? Sorry, I don't mean to wish an illness on your child, but before they grow up and get antibiotics, how about we take our young healthy stool and bank it for the future so that when we need it, we can pop pills of our youth stool to repopulate with the things that used to be. It's not a crazy concept. That's theoretical, not actual, but it's not a crazy concept, right?
Well, it's
Um,
not crazy at all because it's similar to how people freeze their eggs, right? It's just you're just pausing time and then
yep.
can you use it at a later date, but those things are still at the younger, more prime. So I see the logic. As you said, if we're not 100% certain about the biome and what it's all doing, we just know that if you use someone else's biome, you can improve disease that's there. We don't know what the long-term
Right.
consequences are. But I would think if I got my child's 5-year poop and then put it in him when he's 20, yes, I'm sure there's some benefits, but what if there are also adverse things of maybe your body has matured and there's certain strains that shouldn't be there anymore. Now I'm sticking it into him when he's older. I mean, who knows? But it's
Right. But and so I'm not sure I would advocate it for just making him healthy, but let's say he gets C. diff. He's
okay.
25 and he gets C. diff. Do you want more antibiotics or a stranger stool? Or do you want his pre-antibiotic stool to reset him back to
That's
where he
fair.
was, right? There's actually one trial in C. diff I'm aware of. It's a lousy trial. It's 5 patients, I think. But patients with C. diff who were given poop transplants or fecal transplants that were bacterially sterilized. So to this point, it was whole human stool, but they filtered it such that viruses and phages, which are very small and archaic, can all go through, but they filtered out all the bacteria. So now it's bacteriologically sterile. It may have other things in it. And they gave it to 5 patients with C. diff. They got better. They cured, again, small study, not controlled, bad methodology. It's poor methodology, and it should be done again with better methodology. But it raises that question exactly, that we focused on these bacteria. I can give you stool with no bacteria, and it probably fixes you too, highlighting that it may not be just those bugs. It's all of this other stuff, and we've kind of oversimplified it by suggesting we can, tease out this bug and give you Akkermansia or Bifido. Again, nothing. Akkermansia is important. Bifido is important. Those are important things. But it's so much more.
Right.
There's so much more circles around that.
No, I will say I appreciate you for at least acknowledging that there's other things in the gut microbiome that's not just bacteria. I have asked this question to so many people, and the answer has always been, well, once you increase the bacteria, it sort of balances the fungus, and then, somehow they just magically play together and it works out. It wasn't a good enough answer, but I just haven't had an answer. So I think I feel more comfortable with we don't know what's happening to everything else that's going on. But we take antivirals or antimicrobials and antifungals and then obviously the antibiotics, and it's just what are we doing to ourselves? And I just don't think we know. And that's where it gets really scary. And that's where I am a bigger fan then, if that's the case, then I would rather have somebody go for a ferment than over taking some of these other medications. So I'm right there with you. I have a quick question. So obviously I don't have access to a lot of some of the more fancier diagnostic tests that you do, but we test like a qPCR stool test or, like our GI maps, and they will show like C. diff A is positive or toxin B is positive. And you mentioned that. So does that mean that that's diagnostic criteria for you had C. diff? Say it's the first time they've ever even seen that C. diff is positive, but they've never done anything that yes, they have loose stools, but does that mean that they are
Right.
positive? Okay. So can you
Not at
also
all.
clarify?
Not unless they have active diarrhea. So again, people
Okay.
are colonized, right? If you went into the nursing home down the street, that's across the street, you can see that nursing home. That is a nursing home, literally, that building out that window over there. And if you went in there and you checked them and did maps or whatever on these people, you'd find C. diff in a bunch of them. And they're not
Okay.
obviously having diarrhea. They're informed daily bowel movements. They're not febrile. They're not sick.
Okay.
So no, to make a clinical diagnosis, you need the positive test,
Okay.
but you also need illness,
Symptom.
diarrhea,
Okay.
literally. And C. diff diarrhea is not subtle. If a patient says, I think I might have C. diff, I'm like, tell me about your bowels. They know it. It's like
Okay.
C. diff patients are real. They're sick and they're pooping a lot and it's miserable and it smells and it's not subtle. If someone's not sure if they have C. diff, they probably don't have C.
Okay.
diff. It's usually pretty dramatic.
If you can clarify, so it sounds like once you're positive, like on a qPCR test, you may forever be positive, even if you're no longer active. And so you need another test to really see. Can you sort of expand on
Yeah,
that?
exactly that. That's exactly right. So a C. diff PCR, and that's what you get on these panels. So
Okay.
whether it's a map or a doctor's or a this, or just when we send stool panels, they BioFire, there's a bunch of companies that make stool panels for infectious diarrhea. That's all PCR technology. And what that really means is an assay that's fast and cheap and accurate and very, very sensitive for DNA. It's not measuring living bug. It's not a culture at all. It's literally measuring, is there bug DNA there? That's what makes it positive. And you can have small amounts of bug DNA in you and not be sick at all. I mentioned, again, a lot of us do. So absent symptoms, a positive PCR is not helpful.
Okay.
So it means they're colonized. They probably are. So you can tell them that, and they probably should change their diet to try to get uncolonized. That would be better for you than being colonized. But we wouldn't treat the C. difficile certainly in that setting. We would treat the biome negative. The other test, and you can get these tests. That's a standard test.
Okay.
So any lab, any Quest or lab, whatever, will run it in EIA. EIA stands for enzyme immunoassay,
Okay.
and it's just so the PCR test is, if you remember your stats from high school, is super, 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 super sensitive,
Right.
highly sensitive. If there's a whisper of C. diff DNA in you, it will be positive.
Okay.
But it's not specific, if you remember those terms. Sensitivity, meaning if you have it, are you going to catch it? Yes, you're going to catch it. It won't miss anything, but it's not specific at all. A lot of those positives are false positives, right? So there's not really a false negative.
Okay.
If you're negative on a PCR, you don't have C. diff. That's probably a true negative, but a positive PCR may or may not be a true positive or a false positive. The EIA test, which is not expensive or fancy, I mean, but you have to order it at a lab place, actually measures not antibodies, but antigens against the toxin per se, the presence, and that's, by the way, how C. diff makes you sick. It's not the bug per se. The bug releases a toxin. The toxin attacks your colon. It's the toxin that makes you sick. So the EIA test is literally measuring toxin level.
Okay.
And that's a marker of, is there bug doing something in you, as opposed to just little bits of bug DNA. So that test is actually less sensitive. You can have false negatives with that test, but it's much, much, much more specific.
Gotcha.
And again, I don't want to, this is not a stats seminar, but that PCR hypersensitive, not specific. If you don't have symptoms, I wouldn't treat someone based on absent symptoms. If they had symptoms, and certainly if they'd had recent antibiotics or something, then of course you would. If that Grandma Minnie just got, a course of antibiotics for her UTI and now has a positive PCR with florid diarrhea, I'm believing that test. I don't need to do another test. In the right scenario, that test clearly tells me she has C. diff. But in a 25-year-old who's not had recent antibiotics and really has more IBS-like sort of symptoms, and they're bloated and they're uncomfortable and their bowels are irregular, but they have not had antibiotics, they're not having fulminant diarrhea, they're probably just colonized.
Okay. So if I hear you right, then a qPCR test, or like those tests that you can buy online, the GI maps, if it is,
and those are all PCRs.
Right. And so that is not specific. But it is highly sensitive, meaning that if you have any type of C. diff in you, it can show positive. It doesn't mean, because it's not specific, it's not showing the antigen or the thing that makes you feel sick. It's not really showing that. So even if you show positive, unless you have the classical symptoms of C. diff, it's not really saying that you have it. But if you do show the positive plus the symptoms, you should absolutely take care of it. And then the other test, the EIA test, it may not be sensitive, but if it's just specific. So if you're positive, you're positive.
Yes, we would treat that. Absolutely. You got it. You nailed it. You got it exactly right. I wish it were simpler. I wish we just had one binary test that was 100% sensitive or 100% specific. We don't.
That's the same problem with Lyme tests too. A lot of these infectious, it's either super specific or super sensitive, and that's
exactly right. So I see, unfortunately, a lot of sequela of Lyme treatment because it's long-term antibiotics, right? So not surprisingly, that population gets C. diff because they're getting sometimes months and sometimes years of antibiotics. I can't speak to whether they should or should not get those antibiotics, but I think it's the same phenomenon. There's a test that people are treating based on a test that's overly sensitive, I think.
I think I know what test you're talking about. So in terms of H. pylori, I see that so common on, again, another qPCR. But at what point do we say, yes, that's something that needs to be treated, because everyone sort of has H. pylori? Again, it's that level of when is it really sick? And then you can pass it on to your partner and then get it back and forth. So do we ever really eradicate H. pylori, or is it just the balance that's in your gut?
Yeah, that's a great talk. So let's segue a little bit. So we're talking about a different bug now, right? H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori. It's kind of a cool bug. It's been around for a millennium. We find it in mummy stomachs, not living, but DNA from H. pylori you can find literally in mummy stomachs. It's probably been a symbiont with humans for a long, long, long time. It's an extremophile, if you know what that word means. It's a bug that can live in an extremely inhospitable environment. There's like bugs that live in 1,000-degree hot vents under the ocean, or bugs that live in the Arctic permafrost. Those are extremophiles. Your stomach's an extreme environment. It has a pH of 1 3 times a day. That would melt a penny. I mean, your stomach is a bucket of acid 3 times a day when you eat a meal. Yet this bug is the only bug that we're aware of that can actually survive that life. And it has tools to do that, to kind of build a little ammonium shell around it. So it lives in human stomachs. It's the only bug that can live in a human stomach. And it's somehow immune from this acid rain that falls on it. We don't advocate. So H. pylori can be found in about a third of adults in this country. It's not rare. And in some countries, Peru or China or India, it can be 80% of people. So lots of people are colonized with H. pylori. You'd asked about if you test versus treatment. We kind of say don't test unless you would treat. So if your patient doesn't want to treat it, don't ask a question you don't want the answer for, right? So don't ask, don't tell, in a sense. It's like the military thing. Don't do an H. pylori test if your patient wouldn't want treatment, and treatment for that is antibiotics and only antibiotics. We don't have a biome therapy for that. It is a course, a 10 or 14-day course of antibiotics. So don't look if you don't want that answer. But if you find the answer, it's a bug that colonizes most people for no problem, but about 1 out of 7 people get an ulcer. And that can be problematic. They can bleed, they can perforate, they can cause problems. And 1 out of hundreds, if not thousands, get stomach cancer. So it is a bug that is a carcinogenic bug. It is a risk factor for stomach cancer. In fact, it's the dominant risk factor worldwide for stomach cancer. If we successfully got rid of H. pylori in this world, stomach cancer would probably halve or more. Wouldn't go away entirely, but H. pylori is the dominant trigger of stomach cancer. And there is now good science that if you take a population who has H. pylori, you get rid of their H. pylori, their rate of subsequent stomach cancer in later life goes down. We don't recommend population-based screening in this country for H. pylori yet. There are countries where stomach cancer is endemic where we do. So for example, in Singapore, where there's a lot of stomach cancer, Peru, we screen people for H. pylori because the math makes sense. Right. If there's enough stomach cancer in your population, it makes sense to screen your population for the main risk factor for stomach cancer. In our country, there's not as much stomach cancer. It's actually 5th or 6th or 7th on our list. There's a lot of colon cancer, and breast cancer, and lung cancer. We see much less stomach cancer. Although I practice next to Oakland, Chinatown, this gigantic Chinese American population where there is a lot of stomach cancer, actually. So we don't screen in a population. But if you get an endoscopy for any reason, we are going to check you for H. pylori. And in fact, if you come to a doctor with a stomach ache, you are probably getting an H. pylori breath test or stool test. They're easy ways to test for H. pylori. They're accurate, actually. They're much more sensitive and specific than the C. diff testing. H. pylori testing is reasonable, much more accurate. And if you see a doc with a stomach ache or a provider with a stomach ache, you're probably going to get an H. pylori test. And if you have it, you probably should be treated for it. You did say, but then you turned into the, well, a little nihilism because we're going to get it back. And I will challenge that and say, no, you're not. Because you're an adult, and I can tell that because you look like an adult. Adults are much less likely to reacquire C. diff once eradicated than children. The children are super sensitive to H. pylori, not C. diff, H. pylori, and almost all H. pylori in the world is acquired in childhood. The childhood stomach is very susceptible to H. pylori. The adult stomach is much less susceptible. So you're not going to get it back from your hubby, actually, if you get it. Very difficult for an adult. So we've done that study. Take 1,000 people, treat their H. pylori, prove that it's gone, and follow them for X years. They don't want less than 1% reacquire it. And they're living in a world full of H. pylori around them. The reacquisition rate in an adult in this country, different in Peru, maybe, because it's much more ubiquitous there. But in your world and my world, you can feel comfortable that once you do get rid of H. pylori, your risk of getting it again, because you have a healthy adult stomach, is literally less than 1%. So you don't reacquire it. Okay. In fact, if you still have it, it's probably because we failed to get rid of it rather than you reacquired it.
So what are the symptoms of H. pylori, like the most classical ones? And then what is causing it? Because my understanding from nutritional therapy, and I'm forgetting the person that wrote why stomach acid is good for you, but it's because a deficiency of hydrochloric acid or stomach acid that would protect your stomach anyway from the excess H. pylori. But it sounds like you're saying these bugs can actually survive even if stomach acid is there. So then what is causing the proliferation of H. pylori?
It's not. It's a symbiotic bug that's lived in humans, like a lot of other bugs. It's not caused by anything. I guess I challenge the cause semantics because it is a symbiont that lives like a lot of the other bugs that live in us that promote health and illness. And by the way, the ID doctors kind of poo-poo us in GI for H, because we're on this kill the H. pylori rampage where, they sometimes wear buttons that tongue-in-cheek say save the H. pylori. And what they mean by that, not really save a bug that causes cancer, but what they mean is be careful, GI world, because bugs that live in humankind for millennia, and this bug has been found, C. diff is probably much more recent, but H. pylori has been around for thousands and thousands, if not more years. Be careful, because bugs that set up shop with humans tend to not just have a bad outcome, they tend to have balanced outcomes. So symbionts, if you're a symbiont and you want to live in my stomach, good job. Don't kill me right away, because I'm your mobile home. I'm where you live, right? So if a bug is reliably killing its host, that's not a good way for a bug to have a long lifespan. So H. pylori doesn't kill many people. Again, 1 in 1,000 get stomach cancer, probably. It's a small number. And there's some very preliminary data, so I'll be careful with this, but that maybe it has some benefits too. Maybe having H. pylori in your stomach is beneficial. And in fact, kids who grow up with H. pylori seem to have less asthma, atopic dermatitis, infectious diarrhea. Now, there's a confounder there, which is they probably got H. pylori because they were in a dirtier, if you will, a less hygienic environment. They got H. pylori from the world around them. And maybe it wasn't the H. pylori that's protecting them. It was the other good bugs
Right.
that they got, right? And we know that we want our children exposed to bugs. The worst mothering thing you can do is constantly wash your kids' hands. And use hand sanitizer, right? Your kid should be playing in the backyard, rolling in mud. By the way, have all sorts of pets. Kids with pets have better biomes than kids without pets. Kids on farms have better biomes. You want your kid exposed to bugs because, again, they're good for us, right? Kids who grow up sterile don't do very well.
Right.
We need bug exposure, and there's at least a theory that H. pylori may be one of these double-edged swords. That while it absolutely causes ulcers, it absolutely causes cancer in a small subset of people, maybe it helps other people in some other way. Less Barrett's esophagus, a weird cancer thing in the esophagus, is lower in people with H. pylori. Why is that? Is that protecting? And it's interestingly even raised a question, how about maybe we should try to find a non-pathogenic H. pylori? So kids are born with this bad H. pylori, but how about we get rid of it and then we find an H. pylori that doesn't have a tendency to cause cancer? There are more and less pathogenic bugs. Find an H. pylori that is less likely to cause cancer, but still protects you from the other, still does the good things. We don't do that. This is pie in the sky, but it's not inconceivable that we will one day give people a beneficial H. pylori while we eradicate their bad guys. So you get it as a kid. By the way, you get it from mom. If you have H. pylori, you can blame your mother. She probably transmitted. It's person to person, oral. You ingest it, and most of us who got H. pylori got it from our mothers. Actually, I'm a little unhappy because there's data that looks at that says if your mother has H. pylori, you're 13 times more likely to have H. pylori if your mother had it. If your father had H. pylori, you're only 4 times as likely to have H. pylori. And I think that's, I think I should be just as big a risk to my children as my wife is, or my ex-wife. But right, I mean, it's because mothers are embracing and cooing and cuddling and kissing, and that's why mothers are giving H. pylori to their children. I'm not saying they shouldn't do those things. In fact, they should do those things. Fathers will know the world is parentally gender equality when fathers are just as risky for H. pylori to their kids as mothers are.
What would be an interesting study is to test the countries, so Singapore and Peru, and see what does the H. pylori look there, and then maybe the countries that have the least amount of stomach cancer, how does their H. pylori look? And if still both countries have a similar amount of H. pylori, maybe just examining the nuances there, and maybe we would get more answers. But it sounds like from what you're saying, instead of just going after the bug, maybe we just strengthen our gut. And over time, if most people or a subset has H. pylori and it's not harming you, maybe it's okay. And it's that balance. And if we're just trying to eradicate with an antibiotic, not only will we possibly disrupt a balance, but also then you're risking yourself for C. diff and
Right.
whatever other illness.
It's an important balance, and I wouldn't look for H. pylori unless I had a reason to.
Okay.
And good reasons to being you have a stomach ache. That's a good reason to. It does cause
Persistent?
gastritis and ulcers. So everyone has a little bit of a stomach ache, but if you have a stomach ache, then it's a rational. I don't mean one day if I ate a bad avocado and my stomach hurts, but an ongoing, indigestion, dyspepsia, call it whatever you want. That would be a rational reason to look for H. pylori on the premise that maybe A plus B equals C. It's that the bug is causing that. But I wouldn't look at an asymptomatic person, again, because I wouldn't suggest to do that. If your mother died of stomach cancer, I hesitate to say that to anyone. Or if your mother died of stomach cancer, your mother probably had H. pylori. If your mother had H. pylori, you probably have H. pylori. I should probably check you for H. pylori. And that's probably the one thing I can do to lower your risk of stomach cancer.
That's
Actually,
fascinating.
we do that in family members of people with stomach cancer. We don't yet, we might one day, we don't yet screen a population, but first degree relatives of someone, particularly children of someone with stomach cancer, we screen them for H. pylori. That's a rational thing to do.
What about PPIs, H2 blockers? I know some people use it because, hey, I have heartburn, we'll use this. Let's just turn off all your acid, which I think is kind of crazy. But people also use it to balance histamines. If people just feel so bad in the mast cell space, they use those temporarily as a band-aid. But my concern is long term. And then when you use PPIs long term, it messes up your microbiome. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so no question about it. So we're talking about acid suppressive drugs, right? And there's Tums and Rolaids and antacids, and they don't do much. They last for
Okay.
5 minutes. They don't change our biome. They're not dangerous. They don't fix anything really. They
Right.
make you feel better for 5 minutes, but they're not harmful. So you don't have to worry about that. And they're probably a reasonable source of calcium. Then the next step up from Rolaids and Tums and antacids is what you call histamine blockers. And the main entry in that world is famotidine, which was sold once as Pepsid or still as Pepsid is a brand. You don't need the brand. You can buy famotidine on Amazon for nothing. It costs a penny a pill or something. And it's an acid lowering medicine, but I actually like it because it's a relatively short duration acid lowering medicine. So again, for your patient who's histamine sensitive or your patient like me who sometimes has heartburn at night after dinner, you buy a few hours of moderate acid suppression. That's probably not biome disruptive and it's probably not harmful because it's not a ton of acid suppression.
Okay.
You mentioned PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. They're a bazooka compared to the cap gun of famotidine or Pepsid. Omeprazole or lansoprazole or all of those. Prilosec, they're sold as a million different things. Those are a log scale up, and they can suppress your acid for hours and not, if not days, for long periods of time, profoundly. And you're absolutely right. We don't like that. That's not healthy. Acid has a role. By the way, we're switching between two topics here, but that's a risk factor for C. diff. Not having gastric acid, being on a PPI is a risk for C. diff because these spores come in, and if you have acid in your stomach, they die in that bucket of acid. But if you are on a PPI and you no longer have a bucket of acid there, those spores can get right through and head to your colon because you're on a PPI. PPIs are an unequivocal risk factor for C. diff and C. diff recurrence. So we don't love PPIs. They're not good for our biology. They're generally not. That being said, there are a couple of things on this planet where they're necessary. If you have a bleeding ulcer, maybe not a regular garden variety ulcer, you could probably treat that with famotidine. But you're in the hospital with a bleeding ulcer. I need your acid gone right now. I need to do that with a PPI, at least in the short term. And you're probably going to get a month or two of that PPI to heal up your ulcer. If you have something, this thing I mentioned before, Barrett's esophagus, which is a precancerous risk of the esophagus due to acid reflux. We know that if we give those people PPIs, I may mess up their biome, but I lower their risk of esophageal cancer. So most people would take that trade-off. You'd say, okay, I'll lower, if this medicine lowers my risk of esophagus cancer, I'll fix my biome later. I'll eat more, good foods. But so there are a couple of things. You had a scar in your esophagus. There are a couple of things where you have to use a PPI medically. It's just the benefit is so much greater than any of the risk we're talking about. But if you don't have that benefit, if you're just taking it because or you got a little indigestion, I try to stop that really aggressively with a lot of my patients because I think PPIs are disruptive. And if you're not taking them for a really good reason, you probably shouldn't be. They are not.
So why do gut doctors offer that as or maybe it's the general practitioner, but that is one of the first things that is recommended when, hey, my stomach hurts or something's wrong with my gut. It's like, let me throw you on this.
Because I want to get you out of my office and it helps. And I'm not worried about the 5-year downside, right? I'm worried about now, or they are.
It's horrible. Okay.
At one point, not today, but they were the third most prescribed drugs
Believe it.
in the world at some point when I looked at this, not now. Number one, by the way, was SSRIs.
Of course.
Number two was statins.
Mhm.
And number three was PPIs. This is not, it may be, that may be very different today. But so yeah, we throw these at people because they work. People feel better. Everybody has heartburn. Back to our diet. We're a little overweight. We eat crappy food. Everybody has heartburn. And they're magic. They work very well. They used to call Prilosec, when it first came out, it was purple. Was branded as very purple. Now it's not as generic, but they called it Purple Jesus. That was what my vets would call it at the VA hospital because it worked. They felt better. It's effective. And if you have a pain syndrome like chest pain from acid reflux, you don't care about your biome 5 months from now. You care about your chest pain now. So they're inexpensive. Their side effects are distant. They're not so you don't. The provider doesn't have to really worry about that side effect because that side effect is a way downstream side effect. If it caused you to have anaphylaxis and die, no one would use it, right? But the consequence is later, I guess. So yeah, we overuse them. There's no question we overuse PPIs. Again, I don't want to leave your listeners or viewers with the impression that if you're on a PPI for a good reason, you should stop it. because there are good reasons to be on a PPI for sure. And I prescribe it plenty, but I also take care of a lot of sick GI people. But if you're just taking it, that's part of the reason, by the way, when you buy over the counter like Prilosec, it says take for 14 days.
Right, I
That's
saw
what
that.
the FDA told them to put on the box, for partly for this reason, because we don't want people just, it's not because on day 15 your head's gonna explode or something, or or your hair will fall out. None of that's gonna happen on day 15. But if you look at any PPI over the counter, it will say 14 days. And they're sold typically in 14s for that very reason.
So when I first came into this holistic nutrition space, I thought all medicine bad, right? Like it's so easy to go from one pendulum and then go all the way to the other side and say all the pharmacy, everything is bad. But what I've realized with working with super chronically ill people, there's actually this gray area where actually I now believe that there are pharmaceuticals that really help people. And it's not, yes, we absolutely overuse antibiotics, but there are times where antibiotics can save a person's life. We have people that are really, really sick with mast cell, and those PPIs are what's keeping them to be able to be stable in a day. So it's just this hard balance, and it has to be an individual's decision. I just wish that the doctors, when giving it, would share, hey, you should only use this for a period. It's truly a band-aid unless you have these severe illnesses. And there is a risk that you are ruining your biome, and which essentially is your immune function long term. And I wish they would share that and then say, it's up to you if you'd like to take it. But obviously,
As you know, the problem is our system is messed up in a lot of different
yeah,
ways, but one of them is that doctors are radically overworked. The
yes,
amount of money a doctor gets for seeing a patient has gone down every year. The
right.
last 10 years, it's a third less than it used to be. Yet everyone's practice costs twice as much to run. So what do doctors have to do? And I don't want to whine, and I have a very privileged life and I'm grateful for it, but you don't have the time you used to have to sit with a patient. So it's faster to just write the script and then they're gone, right? And then and the problem, it's not the right thing to do. Of course it's not, but I think a lot of providers are boxed into this system where we've created this kind of, you have to see people in 15 minutes.
Right.
And then on top of that, you have to check 77 boxes to prove are they wearing a seatbelt? And did you ask about this? And did you ask about that? Because someone's going to, look at your chart and make sure. So you waste all your time on this ridiculous, everyone fills out all these forms. It's because it's not because we want you to do that. It's because someone's asking us to prove that we did that. So we waste all of our time on this. And on the screens, you've seen the stats, of course, right? A healthcare provider today spends more than 50% of their time facing a screen instead of facing a patient. Used to be 10% of their time, right? We saw 90% of our times with a patient that I might spend 10% writing a note or scribbling a note. The average US doctor spends over 60% of their time, and you may have 15 minutes with that doctor. That's all the doctor can afford to give you, and they have to spend 10 of those damn 15 minutes typing on the flippin' health record because you got to feed that beast. That's a whole different conversation. But so again, I'm not whining. We all have a very, very privileged life, and I'm grateful for the place I'm in. But there are these things that foster that,
Right.
that don't allow. You may have a different kind of practice where people are seeing you electively, and you have the luxury. It's a great luxury. I have a luxury of being an old man who's made enough money, and I can see people in 45 minutes. I do. I have 45-minute appointments. All of my appointments are 45 minutes, and I need 15 of those for the computer probably, or more. But that's a privilege that I have because I am old and mature, and I've made enough money and built a practice and blah, 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 that I can choose to practice that way. But young doctors today can't choose to practice that way. They're getting snapped up by a system, a Kaiser, a Sutter, a Stanford, whatever, and they're being watched, and they got to see 3 patients an hour.
Right.
Right. It's a
yeah, the medical system is definitely broken. So I think yes. So what would you do then if you say maybe you're not working with the most sensitive in the GI world, but a patient comes in with a stomach ache and persistent, whether it's like a mix of constipation and loose stools, but they're just having stomach issues. What would be your first step if it's not necessarily PPIs, H2 blockers? What would be the first test? And I know it's sort of, all over the
Yeah,
board.
it's obviously individualized. It's hard to give a generality for all comers. A little bit depends on their age and the sort of their underlying health and wellness. So, a healthy 25-year-old college kid is a very different patient than a 77-year-old who's been through the ringer and has emphysema, and other stuff. So it might be different. I'll be looking for different things, obviously, in that setting. We worry about cancer in older people. We don't really worry about cancer in 25-year-old college
Okay.
students. They don't have stomach cancer. That just literally doesn't happen. So I don't have to start putting cameras in them or getting CAT scans or things like that. I talk a lot about diets and dietary triggers, and I encourage people to kind of keep a diary and or find one online to kind of a lot of in my world is really two things in the simplest way, three things. One is identifying cause and effect, and that's hard. That's really hard to do. People are having a problem. We need to dive into what's triggering that for them, whether it's a food or a stress or a medicine, right? And we look at their med list and we talk about their lifestyle. We look at how they eat. So what is it that is kind of triggering that thing? That's kind of one of the things we can do. You'd mentioned earlier something about sort of you got to try something sometimes and see if it works. And there's nothing wrong with that. So sometimes I will try famotidine or something for someone, or a lot of times we'll do dietary avoidance trials.
Okay.
Give me 2 weeks off gluten, give me 2 weeks off dairy, give me whatever stuff like that. We will work on. I might check some blood or stool test. It depends on the patient, certainly. I might look for H. pylori, which can be done with a stool test without a camera or anything like that. That's a reasonable thing to do in a stomach ache patient, especially if they're of an ethnicity that has a higher rate of H. pylori. So in a simple way, non-US born patients have a higher rate of H. pylori than US born patients. Immigrants there's less native H. pylori in this country than in other parts of the
Okay.
world. So there may be more H. pylori in that. So again, if the Berkeley student is a 25-year-old kid from Dubai, I may check him differently than the kid who grew up in Austin.
Okay.
Necessarily, who might have a lower risk of that. We sometimes get blood tests looking for like anemia and things like that, make sure the liver's working okay. So we do a CBC and a chemistry panel. I will sometimes, if their bowels are off, I might look for blood in their stool. I might look for inflammation in their stool. There's some inflammatory markers both in the blood and in the stool that we might check on a patient. Because one of my things, again, the 25-year-old, I'm not worried about cancer, and the 75-year-old, I am. The 25-year-old, I'm worried about colitis and Crohn's and inflammatory things. So I might be more focused on looking for, is there markers that I can see of systemic inflammation? And if there are, then they might get imaging or a camera somewhere. So I appreciate I'm not giving you a linear answer. I'm sort of wandering, but I
No,
think
I think that
that's
was helpful. I mean, you shared different nuances and then what you would do, which makes a lot of sense because how do you treat a stomach ache is only as similar as someone else's stomach ache, right? They're so different.
right.
One last question.
Yeah.
So in terms of colonoscopies, so it is nearly a $50 billion business. So then whenever that happens, because the standard care did not help my own healthcare journey, and so then I had to go to this alternative world and it's helped me a lot. But I've swung back a little bit with the chronically ill, realizing that, hey, yes, steroids aren't good, but some people are in so much pain that situationally they may need it. And so I've definitely not as dogmatic about this is right and this is wrong. There's truly gray for certain individuals. But with the colonoscopy world, just the little that I looked into, it doesn't seem, and I may be totally wrong, so I just want to share, but there were a couple studies I looked into that said that of this like 50,000 population, the people that did the screening, there wasn't a benefit. And in fact, the people that didn't get screening, those were the ones that had less cancer risk than the people that did get the screening. There are other studies that I saw that um, sometimes you miss the polyps, especially in I forgot what part of the colon, but in certain parts of the colon, you can't even
Mhm.
see the polyps. And so there's all these reasons of maybe it's not the best thing to do, and maybe it's not as efficacious. And we have been doing these screenings, yet there's more colon cancer than ever, but not a lot of people are dying from it, or there are people dying from it, but not as many as the numbers that we're screening. So all to say, do you feel that colon tests are that everybody
Yeah, I
should
can
be
riff on
getting?
that very easily, and I can do it hopefully in 3 minutes so we
Okay,
don't keep
okay.
people too long. But so let's just start with colon cancer matters, right? It is literally the number 2 cancer killer in
Okay.
this country. So it's not a trivial thing. We're not talking about an esoteric thing. It is behind lung cancer, it's number 2. And if we got people to stop smoking, it would probably be number 1.
Okay.
So it's a problematic cancer. It actually is going down. Colonoscopies
Okay.
are saving lives, not far from perfectly, and I'll elaborate on why that is. But don't believe there's finally really good data that we are bending the curve of
Okay.
colon cancer deaths. with a lot of tools, not just colonoscopy. It's certainly not the only tool. What do they say to a man with a hammer? Everything is a nail. I'm a colonoscopist, so that's how I see this. But colon cancer matters. We have to attend to lowering that risk or preventing that risk. And there are effective ways to do that. That's the good news. You don't have to get colon cancer. But colonoscopy is one of them, and not the only one of them, certainly. It costs money. It costs more money than other things. It is resource intensive. You have a nurse, you have an anesthetist, you have me, you have a tech, you have a post-op nurse. I mean, it takes 5 of us to do this. It takes an hour of your day. You're going to be with me for 3 hours of your day. You're going to take a day off work. Not only that, your husband has to take the afternoon off work to come and pick you up. You may have an out-of-pocket cost, and I could hurt you. In theory, it's very, very rare, but it's an invasive test. I'm putting a camera in someone, I'm sedating someone. Both of those can have a risk. So there's a lot of things not to like about colonoscopy. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of people. It has a risk. That being said, it works, and I'll come back to that. There are other tools that we have too. And again, I'll never suggest that's the only tool to do this. I'm actually a patient in a healthcare. I'm a doctor in private practice. I'm a patient of Kaiser. You probably know what Kaiser is. You lived out here before. Kaiser is a big, giant West Coast kind of HMO setup. Kaiser doesn't do standard colonoscopies. Kaiser has a program where they mail to your house a $2 card that you take a swab, you poop, you take a swab, you smear the card, you mail it back, comes with a postage paid mailer. It goes back in. It's called a FIT test, which stands for fecal immunohistochemical test. And it's looking for blood. That's what it's looking for, microscopic blood, on the premise that if you have cancer, cancers tend to bleed. And if they bleed, we can find that blood in your stool. It's very logical. Kaiser does it in extraordinary, it costs them $3 per test. Colonoscopy probably costs $1,000, or I'm making up a number, but Medicare probably pays about $1,000 for a colonoscopy. So this thing is a lot more cost effective than that. Kaiser's been doing it for 20 plus years. In fact, in the New England Journal, they published their report just last year that they're saving lives with that, like with colonoscopy. And more importantly, the reason I love the Kaiser experience is that they're also, they had, when they started their 20-year experience, they measured and reported, to their credit, a real disequity in who was getting screened. And that is, the more affluent, the more Caucasian population was getting screened at a higher rate than the non-white, non-affluent population. And that's because people were smart and reading and asking, and we were probably treating them differently too for all those reasons. When they instituted this programmatic thing where every single patient above the age of 45 gets it mailed, they get an email, they get a phone call from a friend of mine. It's a robocall. He doesn't literally call them. He recorded the call. And they get very good adherence. People send their stuff back in. And over a 20-year period, not only did they show they saved lives, that wouldn't have got them on the cover of New England Journal of Medicine. We knew that from other studies. They also got rid of their disparity. They got rid of the disequilibrium, or the disequity is probably a better word for that. All of however you slice up their patients now, they're all of the same screening rate. They got rid of any sort of, so it's a very good test. It is a cost-effective test. You can do it on a mass population very well. I think that's an excellent alternative. Sometimes we say the best test to prevent colon cancer is the one that gets done. So whatever you or your mother or your family member is going to do is frankly good. Okay. One nuance to come back, because I can't walk away from this and not promote colonoscopy. I'm a colonoscopist. So, but I just told you how good FIT testing is. FIT testing is totally appropriate. No one should feel that's not appropriate medical testing. It saves lives. It is an appropriate medical test. But it's really, there's a semantic piece that I think gets lost in that, which is that all of these tests, and by the way, there's blood ones coming. They're not here yet. But there's going to be the equivalent of that very shortly. We are going to have blood tests to screen for colon cancer. They are coming. They're not ready. In 3 years or 5 years, we'll do a talk on that. They're coming. But okay. So in 5 years, we may not be talking about poop tests. We may be talking about a blood test. But all of these tests are cancer detection tests. FIT tests find cancers. They detect cancers quite well, as does a colonoscopy. FIT tests don't prevent future cancers the same way a colonoscopy does. They tell you, are you bleeding today? A colonoscopy does something for your $1,000 and tiny risk and day off work. Colonoscopy buys you something else. Now, you may choose that you don't want that something else. You may be really happy with doing that FIT test once a year, but a colonoscopy looks for precancerous polyps. If we see precancerous polyps, we remove them safely and easily. And not surprisingly, if I take out a precancerous polyp, you are going to get less cancer for at least 5 years down the road. So the protective stool tests and Cologuards and FIT tests are good cancer detect. They're all pretty reasonably good cancer detection tests. I would opine that a colonoscopy is also a good cancer detection test, but in fact is also a cancer prevention test. And the nuance of those semantics is important. Now, you're paying price for that. You're taking a risk, and maybe you would rather do, there's nothing wrong with doing the FIT test every year or something like that. So that's the nuance. There's not a right answer. There's certainly not a single right answer. A lot of people, I get colonoscopies, but of course I do. That wouldn't surprise anyone. And I'm pretty sure 99% of gastroenterologists get colonoscopies. Because wouldn't it be ironic if we got colon cancer, right? So one thing we can do, right? We don't scope ourselves, by the way. We scope each other. We share with our partners. There is a video, a Japanese gastroenterologist scoping himself on YouTube, if anyone wants to search for that. Self-colonoscopy, some crazy dude in Japan on a chair, put a hole in the chair and literally scoped himself. I assuredly will not be doing that anytime soon.
So is there a risk, though, that when you're going in with the camera that you poke the colon? And of course there's a risk, but is that risk common or is it rare?
In the work, when we tell people about this, the number we're sort of advised to quote is it's roughly 1 in a couple thousand for a perforation, that particular thing. I've been doing this 25. I don't mean to toot my own horn. That's not what this is about. I don't need business. I'm going to retire before it's too long. But I've done over 20,000 colonoscopies, and I have one. I am not a perfect human, and I've encountered one colon that tore at a seam, that he'd had prior surgery, and we fixed him. He was okay. But I've had one in 20,000, not one in 2,000. So the number is probably somewhere in between those two numbers, basically.
Okay, so if I hear you correctly, the FIT test, which is funny, my parents live in Los Angeles still. They are part of Kaiser and they get those tests. And so the first time I was like, oh, this is what you do. I never realized that was for cancer detection. And so those FIT tests, though, while you could take it every year, it will only detect once you already have cancer. Whereas the colonoscopy, yes, it could detect if you have cancer, but it can also detect any precancerous polyps.
Exactly.
So for that reason, a FIT test may only be beneficial, but you're already cancerous. And then, so what we do in our practice is if we try not to diagnose a C. diff, obviously what you said, if they're symptomatic, but if we see a GI map and it's red all over, so they have H. pylori, at least they're sensitive and positive for it, and then same thing with C. diff, and then their CRP marker, which is the marker of inflammation, is also above 1 when they're eating a low inflammatory diet, then we'll say, I think you might want to check with your GI doc. And that's how we sort of do it, because we don't know if there's and also in the GI map, they also show a little bit of the blood in the stool or in the colon. And so we ask them, did you have any oral issues? You're bleeding. But if not, I don't want to risk that. Hey, our client may have cancer and we don't know. And so then we will say, there's pros and cons, but you may also want to go visit a GI doc.
I would totally agree with that, with a few caveats just for the viewers and listeners, which is if you are high risk for colon cancer. So we're talking about everything I just said is true of what we call average, most of us, average risk people. But if you have, for example, a first-degree relative with colon cancer, if your parent had colon cancer, particularly if they had it at a young age, you're no longer average risk, and you in fact need to get a colonoscopy. We're talking about colon cancer prevention. Everything I said before is kind of aimed at an average risk population, which is most of us, frankly. But recognize that there are people who are at higher risk, and for them, colonoscopy is the only answer. I know that sounds self-serving, but if you have a first-degree relative with colon cancer, you get a colonoscopy. You don't get a FIT test or a Cologuard test or anything else. If you have ulcerative colitis, you get a colonoscopy. There are a bunch of things. If you have any blood in your stool, if you're pooping blood, you're getting overtly, you're getting a colonoscopy. So that whole conversation, which is valid, FIT testing is fabulous for 90% of the world, probably, but for a subset of people, you're getting your colonoscopy.
And then for that higher risk population, which we have a lot of people that have UC in the community, but how often should they get a colonoscopy?
So we start at 45. We used to start at 50, interestingly, because 50 was a round number, and we live in a base 10 math. We have 10 fingers and toes, so we chose 50. It was the wrong number. We chose it because it was a memorable number. Everyone can remember get your colonoscopy at 50, but in fact, we were missing a whole bunch of people in their 40s. So 3-4 years ago, I think 5 years ago, maybe we said, no, move it back to 45. So now the official start date is 45 for all comers. You start at 45, right? You get your first exam, and then the next exam is based on the first exam. So there's not, the outer limit is 10 years. So we believe a good, well done, well seen, well cleaned out negative colonoscopy, we tell you, see you in 10 years. Some people think we can maybe even make that 12. But again, we have 10 fingers and toes, so we chose 10. So we send you away for 10 years. Nothing elongates that today, but things can truncate that. So if your mother had colon cancer or your father had colon cancer, it's 5 years, 100%. It's down to 5 years. If you have a couple of polyps, it's 5 years. If you have big polyps, it might be 3 years. So it's a variable that depends on each case finding. But in a healthy, well person who has a good quality negative exam, we tell them a decade. You get to not see me, and that's not bad. That's better than your mom is doing those tests every year and swabbing up stool from the bowl and putting it on a card and mailing it in. You might say to your mom, "Hey, mom, would you rather do that every year, or maybe have one colonoscopy that buys you 10 years?" And I'm not putting your mom on the spot, but some people would choose one or the other.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So our practice has been focusing a lot on the mind-body system. So how our nervous system impacts. And then you see that the enteric nervous system absolutely gets impacted by high cortisol, or the nervous system getting dysregulated, then dampers down the enteric nervous system, which then reduces your serotonin, which is mostly made in your gut. And so how much do you think that our stress levels and the way that we are living in this busy, stressful, toxic world is impacting our microbiome?
A lot. I mean, the short answer is a lot. And you understand the terms probably better than I do. And you're using the right words that I probably won't use as elegantly, but there's no question, right, that it does. I try not to let a patient think that I think their illness is, quote, caused by or due to stress entirely, because sometimes that sounds like I'm blaming them in a way.
Sure.
If you just meditated more or did yoga, you wouldn't have this problem. That's not true. In our hospital, doctors are all burned out. So what do? They give us yoga classes as if somehow yoga is the end of all stress on this planet. It's not, as it turns out. But so I don't want to tell them that the stress is causing their problem. Now, it may be raising this level and messing up their biome and that stuff, but I call it the volume control. It's kind of how that may not be as biologically true as I want it to be, but I think it's a fair way to think about it, that stress is a very clear volume control. And patients understand that in a way. If you think about sort of, you have a little backache or ankle, something trivial, whatever, that when you're home and doing nothing, it really bothers you because you're focused on it. But you go to Disneyland with the grandkids, you forget all about your ankle because your ankle's not any better. You're just distracted by other things and you're happy and you're playing with your grandkids, and who cares about your ankle? But then you're home at night all alone and you're watching the news, and now you're worried about your ankle and you're stressed. You hear that your kid got a D in physics or something and might not get into Harvard, and and you're stressed. So those things clearly amplify the signaling, right? What is pain? Pain is kind of, in the simplest way, a nerve signal from your gut pain, right? You are innervated, our bowels are innervated, and those signals reflect in our brain. And that's what we perceive as pain. And it is signaling, right? And we humans have the amazing ability to modulate those signals, right? And maybe one example of that is you walk into a room that smells bad, and 3 minutes later, you're still in the room, it doesn't smell as bad, right? It doesn't. We know that. You walk into a smelly room and the smell dissipates. The smell hasn't dissipated. The exact same number of methane and sulfur molecules are still in that room, but your brain is smart enough to say, okay, he noticed, it ain't going to kill him. He seems to be staying in the room, turn down the signal, right? And pay less attention to that signal. You can do that experimentally with stimuli in the intestines. You can put balloons in tushes or in stomachs and inflate them and deflate them. And if you do that experiment to someone who's getting a hand massage and hearing birds chirp in their ears and watching a waterfall, they get to threshold X before they perceive this symptom, the perception of the balloon or whatever. Now do the same thing and put their hand in ice water, flash a strobe light, and play death metal in the background. and they perceive the exact same thing at half the signal. They are perceiving it. They are hyper, they're not making it up. It's not in their head. I'm blowing up a balloon in their tush. They are responding to a real signal. But when they're stressed, so to speak, in this case, I'm creating stress for them, they are hypersensitive to that signal. It's a real signal. There's a balloon in their tush. So that's how I kind of explain it to them. You're not making this up. It's not in your head in that conception. It's in your belly. Something is, whether it's distension or spasm or something, there's a signal there. But when you are stressed and anxious and perseverating and COVID and all this other life stuff, those signals get amplified. And I think when you are in a less stressed place, you have the humans have a really good ability to dampen down that signaling. That's a
No, that's
long answer to a short
no,
question,
no, that's
Judy, but
great. That's great. I completely agree with you. And I think what part that where people say, well, I'm not that stressed. I think there's 60,000 thoughts that we have every day, and we are only hyper aware of maybe a tenth of that. And so if you're watching something negative like the news and it's fear mongering the night before you go to bed, you wake up, you might just be a slight more on edge because of what you just pinged your brain with. And then you go in and to work, and the first thing that may trigger you because you're already sort of in a bad mood because of whatever you watched and maybe it affected your sleep. And then it may cause you to have more cortisol because you're reacting badly. And then that totally impacts your gut and how you're digesting. And then it impacts eventually the microbiome. And so to me,
100% yes.
it's so important.
I think it's all of those are features in this soup that we are. And I think they all play a role. And your degree is holistic, right? I mean, that's in the name, which is the very important part of seeing that whole soup, right? It's not just this nerve or that bug or right. It is that whole holistic answer. I think you're spot on.
Yeah, and I think it just goes back, if we circle back to the very beginning, that's why one strain is not going to fix your microbiome. So
Exactly right.
totally on the same page. Thank you so much for this. You are such a fun person to interview, so I will give you that. It's very educational and also entertaining, so I appreciate you so much. Can people go directly and work with you? It sounds like yes. Where can people find you and all your information?
So there's a bunch of ways. I have a web page that's not my practice where I kind of archive. In fact, this may end up on there. I'm not a very good webmaster, so it's not all that organized, but I try to put on my lectures or my podcast, or I don't have my own podcast channel or anything, but I'm a pleasant enough guest, I hope. And so I archive those on a website, which is my name in one word, neilstollman.com,
Okay.
neilstollman.com, www.neilstollman.com. That's where I archive. That's not my practice. And I can be messaged via that as well. I have a practice in Oakland, California. If there's local people who are looking to see me, you can Google me pretty easily. I have a practice there. I'm abandoning Twitter somewhat, so I have a Twitter handle. You can find me, but I'm rarely there. I'm trying for the stress reasons, cortisol and all those things you mentioned. They seem to amp me up. I am trying to recapture that world on Blue Sky, so I'm also on Blue Sky. And I'm trying to keep it medical. I'm trying to create a kind of medical feed rather than all the other screaming and yelling that happens there. So I don't know what it is, but it's Dr. Stollman at Blue Sky. I can be found there too. So those are all good ways to find me.
Okay, and I'll make sure and put it in the show notes. But thank you so much. This was very insightful. It also gave me more perspective on colonoscopies and just, the importance of the microbiome. Although we don't know exactly what makes it work, we just know that it's a lot of everything and hopefully more natural than not. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Dr. Stollman is so fun to talk to, and he puts a lot of things into perspective, makes it super easy to understand, and is very knowledgeable. I will definitely have him on in the coming years with updates of the microbiome, of FMTs, other illnesses that may end up using FMTs, and even if they have that FIT test as a blood test. There's so much we don't know about the microbiome. And so to me, the obvious answer is always, how can we strengthen our bodies without putting in too much in our bodies that we are risking? What if we're getting rid of this one thing, but then all this other stuff now we're proliferating? We just don't know. And so the safest thing to do is to clean up our diet, reduce the stress, support our health, and strengthen our immune system, an immune system that 80% is in your gut. And if you can strengthen that, how much can we protect ourselves? And obviously protecting our homes with less mold and less toxins. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you have gut imbalances, I hope that this gives you some more ideas in how you can start really healing yourself. Okay, guys, make sure to eat a lot of meat, take care of your bodies and your gut because it's the only place you have to live. I will talk to you later. Bye, guys.